The decision was delivered on October 12, 1876. It came without sentiment, a blunt instrument of civic order, wielded by men whose hands were more accustomed to axes and ledgers than to the delicate matter of a young woman's fate. Ilara stood before the Town Council of Prosperity Gulch, a tribunal of 3 convened in the drafty, half-finished structure that served as both meeting hall and makeshift church. She was 17 years old, a widow for 4 months, an orphan for a decade. Mr. Silas Blackwood, the council chairman and owner of the lumber mill that was the town's heart, cleared his throat. He was a man built of the same hard timber he felled, thick and unyielding. Ilara, the council has determined that your claim on the cabin and the associated 1-acre plot is untenable. A woman alone, so young, cannot be expected to work the land or maintain the property as required by the settlement charter. She did not speak. Her hands, calloused from splitting her own firewood and tending the small garden that had been her husband's pride, were clasped loosely before her. She had already known what was coming. The whispers had followed her for weeks, rustling through the general store and the muddy thoroughfare like dry autumn leaves. She was an anomaly, a loose thread in the tightly woven, practical fabric of the frontier town. Mr. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, a man whose generosity was measured in fractions of a cent, adjusted his spectacles. "It is for the community's good, you understand. The plot is needed for the Miller family, arriving next month. They have 4 strong sons. They will make something of it." He said this as if Ilara and her late husband Daniel had made nothing of it, as if the sturdy cabin, the cleared garden patch, and the neat, stone-lined well were mere illusions. She had 1 week to vacate. Her possessions they magnanimously allowed her to keep. This amounted to a cast-iron skillet, 2 wool blankets, a small collection of well-worn clothes, Daniel's axe, and a small tin box containing $47 in silver coins, the entirety of their savings. The councilman looked at her, expecting tears or pleas. They received only a quiet, steady gaze from eyes the color of a winter sky, a gaze that held a depth of resolve they could not comprehend and thus dismissed as youthful ignorance. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the hall, the heavy plank door closing behind her with a sound of utter finality. That evening, as a cold wind swept down from the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada, carrying the first sharp scent of snow, Ilara did not despair. She sat on the porch of the cabin she was soon to lose, and remembered. She did not remember Daniel's last moments, crushed beneath a falling sugar pine, or the grim faces of the men who had carried him home. Instead, she reached further back, into the repository of knowledge her grandfather had bequeathed to her. He had been a trapper, a man who had lived more of his life in the vast, silent wilderness than in the company of men. He had learned the ways of the Miwok people, had respected their wisdom, and had passed it on to his orphaned granddaughter, not as folklore, but as a practical manual for survival. "Men build their boxes to fight the mountains," he had told her once, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "They stack their planks and draw their square lines, and they think they have conquered the wild. But the wind does not respect a square corner, and the snow does not care for a plumb line. The real strength, the enduring strength, is what has already learned to live here." He had taken her, then a girl of 12, deep into the old-growth forest, to a place the loggers had not yet reached. He had shown her the giants, the ancient sequoias the Miwok called the Wawona, the guardians of the forest. And he had pointed to one in particular, a titan whose base was as wide as a small cottage and whose trunk bore a deep, dark scar. An old fire, or maybe lightning, centuries ago, he had explained. It burned out its heartwood, but the tree did not die. It healed around the wound. It is stronger for it. A hollow place is not always an empty place, Alara. Sometimes it is a shelter. The next morning, on October 13th, Alara loaded her few belongings onto a small handcart she had built with Daniel. She did not look back at the cabin. She pulled the cart along the rutted track leading out of Prosperity Gulch, her face set toward the rising sun and the deep woods beyond. Mr. Jennings, Blackwood's foreman, saw her leaving as he led a crew toward the logging site. He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. "Off to live with the squirrels, are you, girl?" he called out, drawing laughter from his men. Alara kept walking, the squeak of the cart's wooden wheels the only reply. She was heading for the grandmother tree, the wounded giant. She was going home. Finding the tree took the better part of a day. It stood in a grove of its brethren, a silent cathedral of titans that dwarfed the surrounding pines and firs. It was even larger than she remembered, a colossal pillar of cinnamon-red bark rising over 250 feet into the sky. The opening, the ancient wound, was on the eastern side, shielded from the prevailing western winds. It was a dark, triangular maw, roughly 8 feet wide at its base and arching to a height of nearly 12 feet. Stepping inside was like entering another world. The air was still and cool, smelling of rich earth, ancient wood, and the faint, clean scent of charcoal. The interior was a cavernous, irregular cylinder, its diameter varying between 12 and 15 feet. The lightning-charred wood was as hard as iron, polished smooth by centuries of wind and weather. Sunlight filtered down from a fissure high above, illuminating a space that was not empty, but filled with the accumulated debris of ages. For the next week, Alara worked with a methodical, unhurried intensity that would have astonished the men who had dismissed her. Her first task was to clear the interior. She shoveled out centuries of decomposed leaf litter, fallen branches, and loose soil, hauling it all out with a canvas bucket. The work was grueling, filling the days from sunrise to sunset. Beneath the detritus, she found a floor of packed earth and stone. The sheer volume of material she removed was staggering. By the time she was finished, she had excavated the interior down to the hard-packed mineral soil, lowering the floor by a full 2 feet and creating a wide, clean space with a ceiling that soared 30 feet above her head. She had created a blank canvas. Her next focus was the foundation of her living space, a principle her grandfather had called borrowing the mountain's warmth. The earth itself, he had taught, held a steady, cool temperature, a vast reservoir of thermal mass that could moderate the bitterest cold of winter and the most searing heat of summer. To harness it, she needed to build her floor not upon the ground, but within it. Using Daniel's axe to cut roots and a sharpened stick to dig, she excavated a circular area in the center of the hollow, 12 feet in diameter and 16 inches deep. This shallow pit would become the heart of her home. She spent 2 days hauling smooth, flat stones from a creek bed half a mile away. She carried them 2 and 3 at a time on a makeshift sling, her muscles aching with the strain. She laid these stones meticulously into the excavated circle, fitting them together like a vast, irregular mosaic. This was not to be the final floor, but a crucial subterranean layer, a heat sink that would absorb warmth and release it slowly. She had spent nothing, yet had laid the most important part of her foundation. The $47 in her tin box remained untouched, a strategic reserve for the things she could not find or fashion herself. On October 22nd, she walked the 3 miles back toward Prosperity Gulch, but not into it. She stopped at the small, struggling homestead of the O'Connell family, who lived on the edge of town and were viewed with nearly as much suspicion as she was, for their Irish heritage and their stubborn refusal to work for Blackwood's mill. She negotiated with Mr. O'Connell, a man with kind eyes and a weary face, for a cartload of clay from the deposit behind his barn. She paid him $2, a fair price that he accepted with a grateful nod. She also purchased 3 dozen of his wife's carefully stored chicken eggs for 50 cents. Food was fuel, and she was burning through her reserves. Back at the Sequoia, she mixed the clay with water and dry grasses, creating a thick, sticky mortar. She used this to fill every gap between the stones of her foundation, creating a solid, airtight mass. Over this, she spread a 4-inch layer of dry sand, which she had hauled bucket by bucket from the same creek. This layer would provide drainage and further insulation. Finally, she began laying the actual floor. She had seen a shale deposit on her treks, and with a hammer and a sharpened pry bar bought from a traveling peddler for another $1, she spent 4 days carefully splitting and shaping flat pieces of slate. These she laid over the sand bed, tapping them into place and sealing the joints with more of her clay mortar. When she was finished, she had a smooth, solid, dark gray stone floor, slightly raised from the surrounding earth of the hollow. It was cold to the touch, but it was a living cold, a conduit to the deep, steady temperature of the earth. The next great challenge was the opening. The tree itself provided magnificent walls, its fibrous, layered bark and dense heartwood possessing an R value of insulation that modern science would later calculate as far superior to milled lumber. But the gaping maw that served as an entrance was a massive thermal liability. It had to be sealed. She walked to the periphery of Blackwood's logging operation, to the place where they discarded the rejected lumber. Here were piles of planks and beams deemed unsuitable for the mill, wood that was too knotted, warped, or split. To the foreman, it was waste. To Alara, it was a treasure trove. Over several days, she discreetly hauled away the best of the rejected pieces, focusing on thick, 8-foot-long cedar planks. No one stopped her. No one cared. In their minds, she was a half-mad girl scavenging for firewood. She had a different purpose. With a saw she purchased at Mr. Gable's store for $3, enduring his pitying stare as he counted her coins, she began to construct a wall within the tree's opening. She built a sturdy interior frame, anchoring it directly to the hard, charred wood of the hollow. Then, she painstakingly attached an outer layer of planks, followed by an inner layer, leaving a 6-inch cavity between them. This cavity was the key. Every afternoon, she gathered great sacks of dry moss from the northern faces of trees and rocks, along with fallen pine needles. She mixed these materials with more clay and a little water, creating a dense, fibrous, insulating pulp. She packed this mixture tightly into the 6-inch gap between the walls, layer by layer, until the entire structure was a solid, insulated mass. It was a technique her grandfather had observed in the dens of marmots and bears, an application of natural principles to human construction. The final wall was over a foot thick, a formidable barrier against the cold. She fashioned a door from the thickest planks, reinforcing it with cross braces. For hinges, she used thick strips of leather she carefully cut from one of Daniel's old belts, soaked in tallow for waterproofing. A heavy, sliding wooden bar on the inside served as the lock. The cost of her wall, including the saw and a pound of expensive hand-forged nails that cost her $4, was $7. Now came the most dangerous and critical element: fire. A fire inside a wooden tree was a suicidal notion to the men of Prosperity Gulch. But Alara knew that the Sequoia's wood was remarkably fire-resistant, and her grandfather had taught her the principles of heat shielding and controlled drafts. She would not build a roaring, inefficient fireplace like the ones in the town's cabins, which sent most of their heat straight up the chimney. She needed a small, hot, and contained source of warmth. She selected a location against the thickest, most solid part of the hollow's interior wall. Using more stones from the creek, she built a small, U-shaped hearth, no more than 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. The genius of the design was not in the firebox, but in the chimney. High above, the original lightning strike had created a deep, vertical fissure in the wood, running nearly 40 feet up the interior before exiting through a knothole on the outer bark. This natural channel was her flue. The task of converting it was the most perilous she had yet undertaken. She constructed a crude ladder from saplings and rope. For 2 weeks, she spent her days suspended high inside the dark hollow, meticulously lining the entire fissure with a thick layer of her clay and stone mortar. She worked by the light of a single kerosene lamp, her fingers raw, her body aching. She was creating a ceramic pipe inside the tree, a fireproof barrier between the hot smoke and the ancient wood. The physics were sound. The hot gases would rise through this insulated flue, and the surrounding wood, several feet thick, would never reach its ignition temperature. At the base of the flue, just above the hearth, she installed a small, flat piece of sheet metal she had bought for 75 cents. This simple damper would allow her to control the draft, conserving heat and fuel. The entire hearth and chimney system, a marvel of thermal engineering, had cost her less than $1 in materials and an immense amount of labor and courage. By mid-November, the shelter was complete. The final weeks before the snows became permanent were dedicated to provisioning. She built a raised bed frame from scavenged lumber, a small table, and a single, 3-legged stool. The construction was rough, but strong. She spent the last of her savings, $29.25, on a final, carefully planned trip to Mr. Gable's store. She purchased a 50-pound sack of flour, 20 pounds of dried beans, 10 pounds of salt, 5 pounds of cured bacon, a large cast-iron Dutch oven, 2 thick wool blankets to supplement her own, and 5 gallons of kerosene. Mr. Gable tallied the cost, his expression one of morbid curiosity. He was certain he was selling supplies to a ghost. She did not rely solely on purchased goods. Her days were a constant cycle of preparation. She set snares, catching half a dozen rabbits whose meat she smoked and whose pelts she stitched into a warm liner for her coat. She gathered pine nuts from sugar pines, shelled them, and stored them in airtight tins. She harvested wild mushrooms, carefully distinguishing the edible varieties from the poisonous, and strung them up to dry from the high ceiling of her home. She spent an entire week cutting and splitting firewood, not the massive logs the townsmen favored, but smaller, seasoned branches of oak and manzanita that would burn hot and clean in her efficient hearth. She stacked the wood in a dry alcove near the entrance, a formidable supply that she calculated would last her until April. The men from the town did not forget her. Their curiosity, laced with a grim sort of proprietary concern, drew them out to her location on several occasions. Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Jennings rode out in late November, reining in their horses a safe distance from the great tree. They saw the new wall, the sturdy door, and the thin wisp of smoke rising from an impossibly high point on the trunk. "What devilry is this?" Jennings muttered, his face a mask of disbelief. Blackwood grunted, a sound of derision. "She's built her own funeral pyre, a fire inside a tree. The girl is mad. One stray spark and the whole thing will go up like a torch." Ilara, who had heard their approach, opened her door and stepped out. She wore a simple wool dress and an apron, a smudge of soot on her cheek. She looked calm and healthy. "Good day, Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice even. "You cannot maintain a fire in there, girl," Blackwood stated, his tone that of a man correcting a dangerously foolish child. "It is a matter of time before you burn yourself alive. You should abandon this folly and come back. We can find you work in the cookhouse." "The chimney is lined with stone and clay," Ilara replied simply. "It is perfectly safe. The draft is excellent, and the tree itself is fire-resistant." Jennings laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Resistant? Girl, everything burns if it gets hot enough. You're living in a tinderbox, trusting in old wives' tales. It is not a tale, she said, her patience wearing thin. It is thermodynamics. The heat is contained and vented. The wood of the walls never gets warmer than a sun-baked rock. They stared at her, the word thermodynamics utterly foreign and suspicious to them. They saw only defiance and insanity. They saw a girl stubbornly clinging to a fantasy while the real, hard world of an impending Sierra winter gathered its forces. They saw weakness where there was strength, and foolishness where there was a deep and abiding wisdom. Not one of them had lost a family member to a poorly designed chimney fire, a common tragedy in the hastily built settlements. Not one had burned through their wood supply by February, forced to risk their lives felling green, frozen timber. And not one, as they rode away, shaking their heads in shared condescension, would admit that the quiet confidence of the 17-year-old girl had unsettled them to their very core. The first heavy snows arrived on December 3rd, blanketing the high country in a foot of white powder. For Prosperity Gulch, this was the normal course of things. The loggers hunkered down, the mill slowed its operations, and the town settled into the familiar rhythms of winter. Inside her Sequoia, Ilara was warm and secure. The stone floor, warmed by the small, constant fire in her hearth, radiated a gentle, pervasive heat throughout the dwelling. The temperature inside never dropped below 60 degrees, even when it was 10 degrees outside. The insulated walls blocked any hint of a draft. She spent her days reading the one book she owned, the Bible, mending her clothes, and cooking slow, nourishing meals of beans and smoked rabbit in her Dutch oven. She was not merely surviving, she was comfortable. The sky on the morning of December 18th, 1876, was a strange, unsettling shade of yellow-gray. The air was unnaturally still and heavy, and the temperature, which should have been frigid, was mild. Ilara felt a change in the atmospheric pressure, a deep ache in her bones that her grandfather had taught her to recognize. It was a sign the sky was about to fall. She spent the morning securing everything. She brought in an extra supply of firewood, checked the seal on her door, and ensured the chimney damper was set correctly. By midday, the wind began. It started as a low moan in the tops of the pines, a sound that quickly grew into a mournful shriek. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, a blinding white wall of ice and fury that erased the world. This was no ordinary blizzard. It was a convergence of weather systems, a phenomenon later generations would call an atmospheric river, a torrent of Pacific moisture slamming into a mass of Arctic air that had plunged down from the north. The result was a storm of unimaginable violence. Inside her shelter, Ilara felt the ancient tree tremble. It was not the shudder of a structure under strain, but the deep, resonant vibration of a living thing absorbing immense force. The wind howled and screamed outside, a continuous, deafening roar, but the sound was muted by the thick walls of her home. She added a small log to the fire and watched the flames dance calmly. The chimney drew perfectly, the storm outside only serving to increase the velocity of its draft. She was a passenger in a vessel that had weathered 1,000 storms, a ship anchored by roots that plunged deep into the bedrock of the mountain. In Prosperity Gulch, the battle was already being lost. The town's cabins, built with square corners and rigid frames, presented a defiant profile to the wind. And the wind, a fluid force of nature, tore at them with savage glee. It found the slightest gap in the chinking, the smallest crack around a window pane, and ripped it open. The first structure to fail was the new stable. Its poorly anchored roof was lifted clean off and sent cartwheeling into the forest, releasing a terrified chorus of screams from the horses inside. Mr. Gable stood in his general store, listening as the windows on the western wall began to bow inward, the glass groaning under the immense pressure. He and his son tried to brace them with sacks of flour, but a gust of over 100 miles per hour struck the building, and the windows exploded inward, spraying the store with a hurricane of glass shards and ice. The wind-driven snow began to fill the room like dry, suffocating sand, burying his precious inventory in an instant. In his home, the largest and most well-constructed house in town, Mr. Blackwood felt a sudden, violent jolt. The massive stone chimney on the west wall, the very symbol of his permanence and prosperity, had been undermined by the wind. It peeled away from the house and collapsed in a deafening roar of stone and mortar, leaving a gaping hole in the wall. The storm poured in, extinguishing the fire on his hearth in a hiss of steam and plunging the room into frigid darkness. The meticulously joined planks of his roof, which his men had spent a month fitting, began to lift and groan, the nails screeching as they were slowly, inexorably pulled free. The storm raged without pause for 3 days and 3 nights. It was a singular event, a meteorological siege that broke records that had stood for a century. It buried the landscape under 12 feet of dense, heavy snow and reshaped the forest, felling thousands of lesser trees. On the morning of December 21st, the wind finally ceased. The silence that followed was as profound and absolute as the preceding roar had been. Alara awoke to a world transformed. A deep blue, impossibly clear sky stretched overhead. She pushed open her heavy door, a task that required considerable effort against a drift that had piled against it. She stepped out into a landscape of blinding white, a silent, rolling ocean of snow beneath a cold, brilliant sun. The air was sharp and crystalline. She strapped on the snowshoes she had crafted from bent willow branches and strips of rabbit hide. Her home, the great Sequoia, stood unblemished, a silent, red-brown monument of serenity in the midst of utter chaos. Taking a deep breath of the clean, frigid air, she began the long, arduous trek toward the place where Prosperity Gulch had once stood. The journey took her 3 hours. The familiar landmarks were gone, buried beneath the immense drifts. Only the tallest, strongest pines remained, their branches shattered and torn. As she drew closer to the town's location, the scene of devastation began to reveal itself. It was not a town anymore. It was a graveyard of ambition. Splintered beams jutted from the snow like broken bones. A stovepipe lay twisted on its side, its top peeking out from a deep drift. The recognizable shape of a roof lay upside down, 50 yards from where its cabin should have been. There was no movement, no sign of life. A profound and somber silence hung over the ruins. Then she heard it, a faint, weak cry, almost lost in the vast stillness. She turned toward the sound, her snowshoes making soft, crunching noises in the powder. It came from a large mound of snow and debris that she recognized as the remains of the town hall. She began to dig with her hands, the cold biting at her fingers. The wood was splintered and covered in a thick layer of ice. After several minutes of frantic work, she cleared an opening into a small, dark pocket of space beneath a collapsed section of the roof. Huddled inside were the survivors. There were 11 of them, their faces gaunt and gray with frostbite and shock. Among them were Mr. Blackwood, his arm in a crude sling, Mr. Gable, who was cradling his frostbitten hands, and Mr. Jennings, who stared blankly into the darkness, his mind seemingly broken by the ordeal. They had survived by huddling together for warmth, but their time was running out. They were weak, dehydrated, and succumbing to hypothermia. They looked up as Alara's face appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the bright snow. For a moment, they seemed to think she was an apparition, a spirit of the storm come to claim them. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a calm, quiet competence. "I have shelter," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and a fire. It is a long walk, but we must go now." The journey back was a slow, desperate procession. She had to guide them, half carrying the weakest among them, including a dazed and shivering Mr. Blackwood. They stumbled through the deep snow, a ragged line of defeated men, following the steady, determined figure of the young woman they had cast out. When they finally reached the grove of sequoias, they stared in disbelief at the towering tree and the solid, man-made door set into its base. Elara pushed the door open, and a wave of warm, dry air washed over them. The air smelled of wood smoke, bread, and safety. They shuffled inside, one by one, their eyes wide with a combination of awe and shame. They saw the smooth stone floor, the small, efficient hearth glowing with embers, the neatly stacked firewood, the shelves holding jars of provisions, the blankets folded on the built-in bed. They saw a home, a sanctuary of impossible warmth and security carved from the heart of the wilderness. They stood in stunned silence, the sheer, undeniable reality of it stripping away their last vestiges of pride. Mr. Gable began to weep quietly, the sound muffled by his frozen beard. Over the next few days, Elara nursed them back to a semblance of health. She melted snow for water, made them a thin, nourishing broth from dried beans and the last of her smoked rabbit, and tended to their frostbite with poultices of willow bark, an old remedy her grandfather had taught her. She spoke very little, moving about her small home with a quiet grace. Her actions spoke with more force than any words of vindication ever could. Her shelter, her foresight, her knowledge, these were the things that now stood between these men and a frozen grave. The home they had mocked as a funeral pyre had become their ark. On the fourth day, Mr. Blackwood, his voice a hoarse whisper, finally broke the silence. He was sitting on a low stool near the fire, wrapped in one of Alara's wool blankets. He looked at the perfectly joined stones of the chimney, at the thick, insulated wall, at the solid door that had held the apocalypse at bay. He looked at Elara, who was grinding flour with a small hand mill. "How?" he asked. It was not just a question. It was a confession of profound and absolute ignorance. "How did you know?" Elara paused her work and looked at him. Her expression was not one of superiority, but of patient instruction, the look of a teacher addressing a difficult but earnest student. "I did not know a storm like this was coming," she said, "but I knew that winter was. My grandfather taught me that you do not survive the mountains by fighting them. You survive by understanding them. Your houses were built to stand against the wind, so the wind saw them as a challenge. My home is part of the forest. The wind flows around it, like water around a stone in a river." She gestured to the floor. "This stone holds the earth's heat. It releases it slowly, so a small fire is all I need. Your fireplaces were large, so you needed large fires that consumed wood and sent most of their heat up the chimney. Your walls were a single layer of planks. My walls are filled with moss and clay, like a bird's nest. They hold the warmth in. This tree has stood here for 2,000 years. It has survived fires, earthquakes, and countless storms. Its roots are deeper than any foundation we could ever build. I did not build a house to conquer the wilderness. I built a shelter in partnership with it." Her words fell into the quiet warmth of the room, simple, direct, and irrefutable. The men listened, and for the first time, they understood. They had built their world with arrogance, with the belief that their saws and hammers made them masters of the natural world. They had measured their strength in board feet and profits. Alara had drawn her strength from a deeper source, from observation, from humility, and from wisdom passed down through generations. A week later, a rescue party from the larger town of Sonora, alerted by a trapper who had noticed the absence of smoke from the gulch, finally broke through the snow. They were guided the last mile by the steady plume of smoke rising from Alara's chimney. They found the 11 survivors, weak but alive, being cared for by a 17-year-old girl in the hollow of a giant sequoia. They also found the others. The final toll in Prosperity Gulch was 27 dead, frozen in the ruins of their sturdy, conventional, inadequate homes. The story of the girl who lived in a tree and survived the Great Storm of '76 became a legend in the Sierra Nevada. Mr. Blackwood and the other men she saved never returned to the gulch. They bore witness to what had happened, their testimony a somber and powerful endorsement of her methods. They spoke of her not as a mad girl, but as a kind of prophetess, a sage whose wisdom they had been too blind to see. Alara's vindication was absolute, yet it was a quiet, somber thing, haunted by the memory of the lives that had been needlessly lost. She had not sought victory, she had only sought to live. In the end, that had been the most profound victory of all. She remained in her Sequoia home, a solitary, revered figure, a living testament to the enduring truth that the greatest strength is found not in defiance of nature, but in harmony with it.